Good evening, everyone. My name is Fergal O'Keefe from MS Ireland, and you're very welcome to the MS webinar series, The Unspeakable Bits. The theme this month is MS and relationships. So I would like to get questions from anybody here today, and so you're invited to submit those questions to our panel tonight via the questions Q&A tab at the bottom, not through the chat function. So and I'll look at those questions and I can feed them to Trevis, who will ask them to our guests. Our host tonight is Trevis L. Gleason, and our two guests tonight are the EFT couples counsellor Pauline Macey and the family law solicitor Gillian O'Mahony from Lynch Solicitors. They're going to discuss the topics now, so I'll hand over to Trevis and I will rejoin you again at the end. Take care, Trevis.
Thanks very much, Fergal, and hello and welcome to everyone. I'm Trevis Gleason, and you're very welcome to the Unspeakable Bits from a life with multiple sclerosis. I would like to thank Multiple Sclerosis Ireland for their support and giving us this platform to delve into the topics once and frankly often still considered taboo, but are a real and important part of getting over, under, around, and through the challenges of life with this disease. And those of you who have been with us for a while now, you know that we don't shy away from the difficult topics or the questions here on this program. Relationships, in particular, how MS factors into those relationships and the breakdown of them. It's certainly one of those topics that can be considered taboo. And let's face it, Ireland and intimate relationships has changed a lot over the last few decades. But maybe not when MS is part of that equation. So as Fergal said, we invite you to submit your questions to our panel, and we want you to do that in the questions tab, not in the chat function. And your questions will be put through, and we'll get to as many of them as we can tonight. What we can't get to, we'll try to get answers to and put up. This webcast, as with all of others, will be recorded, and it will be posted in a few days. I also suppose that it's not a bad idea to remind all of our international viewers that while some of the specific laws that we'll be talking about here tonight are relative to Ireland, each jurisdiction will have their own takes on such things. I suppose I often say that the world can be divided into two kinds of people. Those who divide the world into two kinds of people and those who don't. But for this case, I think we can divide relationships into two kinds. One is before multiple sclerosis was part of the equation, and one, the relationships that were already underway when a diagnosis happens. So if we look at it that way, Pauline, I'm going to come to you. Let's start at the very beginning of a relationship, when MS is already there. And many of us would want to know when might be the optimal or the necessary time to disclose MS to an employer. So I suppose we should consider telling, or when we should consider telling a partner or a potential partner about the disease. Where does that conversation come in?
Well, I'm sure, like most things in relationship, it does depend on the person and the couple and how ready they are to disclose a big piece of information like that they feel themselves that they are ready to talk about it. I think, first of all, it's how ready that person is, in themselves, how they've come, how they've coped with the diagnosis and how they see themselves, because some people might need a little bit of time with that. And I think that's very important, to respect each person's uniqueness there, just as you would with any other major issue in life. And then I guess the challenge is not to over-identify with the diagnosis. It's there, but there's so much more to that person than their diagnosis.
Right. It's something we have this disease, we are not this disease.
Exactly. And that is so important, because I guess that's what you're going to put out, that, aren't you, to the other person?
Well, I suppose that's the obvious follow-up. It's all right. So we're we're a few dates or whatever down the road, and we decide, all right, I'm ready to tell this person we're ready to take the next step in this relationship. How do you broach that topic? I mean, I've had relationships where MS came into them, and then I've had them where I had the MS and I had to disclose it. I sort of live my life out loud with MS, so that's not. In fact, when my wife and I met, it was at a party, and it was a fundraiser for multiple sclerosis in America. So it was sort of obvious. But how might a person consider that disclosure?
I think a big thing here is safety. How safe do I feel with you? If I'm going to tell you something, if you're the other person, and I've got this big news that this big diagnosis or whatever life-changing issue it might be, I need to figure out how safe do I feel with you to tell you this. And I think that would be a starting point. And then, because how can I build trust with you if I'm holding back something that I'm thinking a lot about, or that's preoccupying my thoughts or taking over some of my life? How can the relationship get going if I'm holding back that? On the other hand, maybe I have to listen to myself if it's an early stages in the relationship and I have other misgivings about the relationship. Well, then, do I really feel safe enough to tell you this, or have I already decided maybe that this relationship isn't going anywhere? An early stage of any relationship is such a tricky stage, isn't it? Because you're still getting to know the person, and so there's so much to consider. Yeah,
and I suppose a big fear factor then would be rejection. If I do feel like, all right, this person seems to be have some serious potential, and then what if I tell them, and we get inside our own head there.
Yeah, and I think even this might be a good stage to get some support from a therapist to talk even about different ways you could manage this revelation or this talking about the diagnosis.
Okay,
because you
very
have
good.
Choices there.
Gillian, since we're talking about those early days in a relationship, you might have some recommendations for the legal preparation side of things that we might have to consider. I mean, are there things that we should think about that maybe people with conditions like MS mightn't have to think about?
Well, I think they may have been things that you touched on a previous webinar in terms of enduring powers of attorney, if people lose capacity, all of that. But I suppose from a family law perspective, you can look at entering a prenuptial agreement. You can look at doing a prenuptial agreement, but that may not take into account if somebody's illness is progressive. It may not necessarily prepare for the legal process. A prenuptial agreement is done obviously pre-marriage, and there's no guarantee that will be recognised by the court. It sets out what people's intent is if the marriage was to break up. Again, I suppose it's a grey area. There is only one opportunity to do one, and that is obviously pre-marriage. But if circumstances do change, if somebody's illness progresses, it may be irrelevant at that point, prenuptial agreement.
So now that's an odd one for an American living here. So a prenuptial agreement is a statement of intent, but it's not necessarily going to be something that is recognized by the courts if things fall apart.
Exactly. Our Irish law is quite unusual in terms of prenuptial agreement. I suppose you have to remember that divorce was only legalized here in 1996. Our constitution is very specific in that it protects the sanctity of marriage. So the law is quite bizarre, or I suppose the law is quite unsure in that, will it uphold an agreement where one is envisaging the breakup of a marriage, where the constitution particularly protects the marriage? And it has yet to be tested before the courts in Ireland as to whether a prenuptial agreement will be upheld.
All right. So someone has actually just asked, the question is, if you're diagnosed with MS after a prenup is written after the marriage, etc., does that basically null and void the agreement?
Well, I suppose if you were trying to argue that the agreement should not be upheld, you would certainly have a strong case there, because there would be a significant change in circumstances, obviously, and if you go before the court, when granting a decree of divorce, has to make sure that there's proper provision for both parties. So what might be proper provision if prior to the diagnosis may not be proper provision when somebody has the diagnosis, depending how far down the road they are, whether it's mild, whether it's serious. So ultimately the court has to make proper provision, regardless of what's in a prenup or what parties have agreed. It's that ultimate power rests with the court.
Yeah, it's we went from how should we disclose in a new relationship to dissolution and prenups. Sorry about that. I was going to try to keep it sort of flowing, but that's just how it's going to be tonight, I think. Pauline, the EFT part of the therapist there, the emotional focus, many people might not have ever heard of that before. If you could just give us a quick little snippet on what that means for people.
Okay, so this is a model that was it's Sue Johnson, Dr. Sue Johnson's model. And I think it is the most researched couples therapy model. It has a very high success rate. It is entirely based, not entirely, but very much based on attachment theory. It is quite an integrated approach, very humanistic as well. But the whole focus is on attachment. The idea that it is, again, like a lot of the neuroscience at the moment is telling us, it's not the survival of the fittest anymore. It's the survival of the nurtured that counts here, that we're mammals, that we're relational creatures, that we are meant to reach out to each other, that we are at our most happy and fulfilled when we know we have at least one other safe, secure person in our environment that we can reach to. So if we have that there, we have a lot going for us. We can survive almost anything.
Well, let's take a look back at during that disclosure, maybe, or those early days again, taking EFT into consideration here. Would there be any typical warning signs that maybe we should look for? Either it's during that disclosure process, or any telltales of possible troubles on a relationship's horizons that are based on those first conversations?
Exactly. I mean, when I talk about safety, I mean primarily emotional safety. We talk about an acronym ARE, which means A for are you available? Are you emotionally accessible? Are you R for responsive? Are you responding to me? Are you E for emotionally engaged? Are you, how much are you there for me? When I'm talking to you about anything significant in my life, to find, just to see how safe it is, maybe to tell you something really big like a diagnosis, am I picking up the safety cues and signals, not just from what you say, but from how you are with me, from how fully available I feel you are, from how present I feel you are with me. We forget that we tend to count too much on words, but it's all the nonverbal signals that we're giving to the other person that actually reassure our mammalian brains. That it's often our tone of voice, the quality of our presence. Those things matter far more than we realize. So
if our gut is telling us that something's not right,
absolutely, we really ought to listen to that, make room for that.
Gillian, let's jump ahead now. And a couple is married, or they're a couple, they're cohabitating, etc. And then a disease like MS or others comes into the picture. How, if at all, does a legal standing of that couple change? Is there any sort of codified law that states that it changes things?
No, it doesn't. No, I mean, nothing really changes in terms of a legal standing until you decide that marriage is over. One party issues proceedings for separation or a divorce, and your status doesn't change until, I suppose, a court order is made.
Okay.
So that's
now,
somewhat down the line.
If we were talking about some of those legal documents, the prenup, etc. Are there, for a couple, any legal documents that we would want to look at making sure that we had? I'm thinking wills and advance directives and that sort of thing when a person is diagnosed with MS, in a healthy couple even.
Yeah, well, a will is obviously a very important document. Everybody should have a will. But I suppose if you have a will, your spouse automatically has what's called a legal right share, so a legal entitlement, and that remains even if the marriage is broken down and until such time as you're divorced. So while you can do a will pre your divorce, if the marriage is over, there may be a difficulty until such time as you're divorced if you passed away.
Okay. Pauline, I think from what I'm understanding about the EFT, one of the things it's basing on relationships that we've had in the past. So we all bring our own baggage into relationships beyond just our disease. How might those early relationships, our childhood experiences, traumas, etc., how might those distort our view of what is acceptable and healthy in a relationship? I mean, back to those warning signs, what might we look for in ourselves that might be worth examining?
Absolutely. Such a good question, such a rich question, because there's so many layers to that. But, we learn so much from our early attachment experiences with our primary caregivers. And apparently, well, John Bowlby did, his research claims that 60% of us have secure attachment. And then the rest of us have a mixture of either anxious or avoidant or traumatized attachment, disorganized attachment, which is like a mixture of avoidant and anxious. But if we are lucky enough to have to emerge from those early experiences with a secure attachment, we're so much more equipped to not just pick up warning signals of negative relationships, but we expect the positive. We have also formed a positive model of self and other, which means that we don't easily let in people who are bad for us into our lives. We attract positive relationships. So this is why so often people are left wondering, why do I always attract the wrong type of person? Because the truth is, we haven't yet unhooked from our past, from those negative models, and those patterns tend to drive current and future relationships because of our expectations and because of the strength of that wiring. But the great thing is that now we know so much more about neuroplasticity, we can change those models. It does take practice. It does mean, as you suggested, slowing down and becoming more aware of your own negative attachment or insecure attachment, whether it is avoidant or anxious, and just being aware. Look, I know I'm avoidant, so I have to work a little bit harder at letting the other person know that just because I go quiet easily doesn't mean I'm not listening to them. It's how we support ourselves with those negative attachment styles or insecure attachment styles.
You use the term neuroplasticity, and those of us living with multiple sclerosis will understand that from and I suppose people living post-stroke as well, as retraining the body, etc.
Sure.
And we might only think of it in a physical sense, in helping the signals get around axonal damage so that we can move our hands again or whatever it might be. But you're saying that same basic chemistry principle also works emotionally.
Absolutely. Through corrective emotional experiences, through discovering that not everybody is out to get me, through gradually building trust, to find, through often it can be slow work or painful work, depending on how much trauma maybe somebody has had in their past. but we know that we because of the power of our attachment longings, our longing to experience security and connection in relationship. Those longings never go away, even when we've had negative experiences.
And I think that all of us who have used the power of neuroplasticity to retrain our bodies know exactly how much work we're talking about here. So,
Yes.
so I can only imagine how much is emotional there. So that we're setting ourselves up for a lot of work there. We got a question coming in, Gillian. Someone is asking about the term living will. That's an advanced directive, I'm guessing, the terminology. You want to explain that just a touch there?
So I suppose a will per se is a will which kicks in, which becomes important, it kicks in really when somebody passes away. But a living will is like your enduring power of attorney, your care directive, which sets out what arrangements you want to apply during your life, but only at a point once you lose perhaps the ability or capacity to look after yourself. So that's what a living will is.
All right, thank you very much, and you're doing a great job to our audience getting questions in, etc. So I thank you for that, and feel free to continue to send those in. We'll get to as many of them as we can. Now let's continue into the kind of that uncomfortable space when a relationship isn't going well. So let's talk about when, or I suppose how, a couple might understand that they need some outside help in dealing with MS or any other difficulty in the relationship. Pauline, how do we know when it's time to bring in a coach?
Well, I think when we get caught in a negative cycle of blaming or tit for tat, who's the worst, who's the biggest offender here, when we can't break out of those negative cycles of communication, when we're just experiencing more distress than connection, when something is threatening the good stuff in our relationship, that the earlier we catch that, the easier it is to repair. But that's harder for couples who are stuck in insecure attachment styles, because they don't even see this as a problem until it gets quite escalated. But I think
sorry, we've got a question that's come in from someone who is the partner of someone with MS.
Yeah.
And they came up in a inverted commas healthy family, etc. And now MS is part of their family, and it's difficult, and they're not sure how life is supposed to work because it's not working the way it used to, I suppose.
Sure.
How do you get if you had that secure attachment coming up, etc., and now you're in a place where everything is a challenge from the partner's point of view? What can we do there?
I think the more you create safety for your partner to talk about what's happening to them, because emotional support is such a big part of MS. And not many of us know what that means. And it does mean different things to each of us. It's a very individual, personal part of us. So just making space for those kind of questions around, what do you need from me? Tell me what's going on for you on the inside around all this. Help me understand how I can help you best.
Okay. Pauline, I'm sorry, Gillian. There's a term that we've all heard on the news and in the media, etc. Coercive control, and when we get into unhealthy relationships, that's obviously that's very bad. Can you help us understand what exactly is coercive control?
Coercive control, I suppose it's something which has been hit the media somewhat in the last couple of years because of a change of the laws in this jurisdiction. It is, I suppose it's the more silent form of abuse. It's the more silent form of abuse. It's a psychological abuse. It's the thing that's harder to pinpoint. So when we talk about domestic violence, you talk about physical violence, you talk about assault, you talk about verbal violence. coercive abuse then would be more perhaps where somebody is isolated. They're isolated from their friends and they lose all their friends because of the behavior of their partner. They lose their ability to manage their finances. The finances are taken over. They're suddenly isolated from society, and they're extremely dependent on that other person because of the way they have managed them. And that is what is now known as coercive behavior. And it has recently become a criminal offence here in Ireland. It's something that somebody can report to the Gardaí. And I suppose the more that's spoken about it, the more knowledge that's out there and the more awareness. And that's really important, the more that's spoken about it. And it's particularly, I suppose, those who are vulnerable, people who are sick, the elderly, they are those who are more prone to coercive abuse.
And I suppose it can be a very blurred line to try to prove, because the partner who is taking over the finances, when, for instance, my brain doesn't work with numbers anymore, so my wife does take over the finances. I've asked her to that, but it could be defended that, well, the person with MS is having trouble doing that, so I'm doing that. So it would be very difficult to prove, I'm suspecting.
It is very difficult to prove. And I suppose typically there may be a number of triggers. Somebody may suddenly, their phone may be monitored, their text messages may be monitored, they may have no control over their email, they may, they've suddenly lost control of all of those. But as you say, there may be a need sometimes for that. So it is the more difficult one. It's a psychological form of abuse, but if those things happen, it may not necessarily be coercive abuse either. It may be required, it may be a reality. Now, Safeguarding Ireland, they have a website, and they I suppose set out different types of coercive behavior and perhaps things for somebody to watch out for. They also set out where they provide details of where to report, and as I said, it's a criminal offence, so it's something where people can report directly to An Garda Síochána now.
So that's who, if you believe that you are under coercive control, it would be to go to the guards.
Exactly. I suppose the first point of contact would be a solicitor, because if there are other forms of abuse, let's say if there was, a verbal abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, we can test that in a way, and then we can decide whether you need protection in the form of a court order, in the form of a barring order, a safety order, a protection order. So there are remedies there. But to get those remedies, you have to, I suppose, satisfy a certain threshold from the court. So if it's coercive abuse, coercive behavior, that is more difficult to prove.
Okay, Pauline.
Yeah, and maybe I can talk a little bit to that, just in terms of catching it again, like if it's part of the negative cycle, that the more security that's there in the connection, the more likely somebody at the receiving end of that is maybe able to be strong enough to tell their partner at an early stage, listen, I don't feel safe with you. I know you may not realize the impact you're having on me when you speak to me like that, or whatever it is, or when you take control of all the finances. I didn't sign up for this. The sooner a dynamic like that is caught at an early stage, it is possible to stop it escalating into something that has to go to the law to get resolved, or because the anxious attachment style can be very pushy. Pursuers in relationship can become very strident. And they often don't realize, like, it's often coming from a place of fear in themselves of, well, what's going to happen to us if you're not able to manage the money? Well, I better shape up and do this here. And, their fear gets out of hand. But if they can actually start to take ownership, of course, ownership is such an important part of this. But if they can start to catch that, hopefully all couples don't have to end up, going to the
Well, that leads me to my question. Are all relationships repairable?
That's such a big question. I I think sometimes relationships run out of, like everything, shelf life, elastic, whatever metaphor you want to use. If again, it's all about catching something at an early stage. And if something can't be repaired, I still think it's possible to end in a way that is respectful rather than, that leaves two people feeling better about the ending than, like, endings don't always have to be disastrous, do they? An ending, a good ending with both people understanding, with a clearer understanding of why we're ending, is a good thing, and maybe they've learned something about what went wrong and what they contributed to the negative pattern they got caught in. So they're less likely to repeat that in the next relationship.
It's funny that you say that Ireland mightn't have caught up with some places. It's the looks that we get when my former wife and her husband come and visit us and stay with my wife and I here in Ireland. Ireland's not quite ready for that sort of chummy relationship in a lot of ways.
Good for you.
Could you address the concept that a bad relationship is better than no relationship at all?
Oh, that's tricky, isn't it? Because it depends what you mean by a bad relationship.
Well, so someone is afraid to be alone, or they feel like because they've got a disease, they might be less than, not worthy of, this might be as good as they can get, and it's better to stay in a relationship that isn't working for me than to be alone.
It sounds a bit fear-based to me when you put it like that. And that's not good for us. Living in fear is not good for us. Like, we're meant to thrive. We are, that's what nature intends for us. And we're not meant to just survive. We are meant to thrive. And if I'm in a bad relationship, how can I thrive? It just sounds very fear-based. Or is that my negative model of self again, not allowing me to expect something good in my life or something good from my relationship?
Everyone deserves something
Everyone
good.
deserves. Yes. Yeah.
Gillian, how do the laws differ, if they do at all, for couples who are married versus cohabitating, co-parenting, the non-traditional couples, gay and lesbian couples who have children, all that? How do the laws differ when it comes to disillusionment? Okay,
so I suppose let's talk about a married situation first of all. So when somebody comes into me and for a consultation, the first thing I would ask of them is the marriage over. Our role would be very different to, say, to Pauline's role. We don't get involved in the decision-making process, to decide whether the marriage is over. Our role is very much to advise on the legal consequences. So that's the very first question: is the marriage over? And sometimes the marriage may not be over. They may be on a fact-finding mission to find out, if they do call time on it, what are their options, what's going to happen. So one of the first things we have to advise, and we're legally obliged to advise, is we have to recommend counselling. So counselling with a view to getting the marriage back on track. If that then is unsuccessful and they come back and they say they don't want to go for counselling, or they've tried counselling, the first thing we have to do then is we're obliged to recommend mediation. So that ties in with one of the earlier topics Pauline mentioned there about a happy ending. So mediation is where the parties essentially come together to try and reach their own solution with the assistance of a mediator. And I'm a huge fan of it. It's, at the end of the day, people have to continue to parent together. They're going to have to attend First Holy Communions, confirmations, graduations, weddings. So if parties can reach their own outcome in terms of who the kids live with, maintenance, that's certainly beneficial. They then come back to us and we legalize it. So if it's a married situation, we'll do either a separation agreement or a judicial separation if you're only living separate and apart for 1 year. If you're living separate and apart for 2 years, you may then qualify for a divorce, and we can legalize it in the form of a divorce. So that's a married scenario. If you have a cohabitant situation, then we recently only had laws brought in here in 2015, which provided protection to parties who were living together and suddenly the marriage, the relationship, somebody called time on it. And these laws were, I suppose, brought in to protect somebody who may have lived in a long-term relationship. For example, they may have given up a career, they may have stayed at home to rear the children, but they didn't have the formal marriage. So the Cohabitation Act was brought in, and those people are entitled to similar protections if you were married, if you've lived together for 5 years, if there are no children, or 2 years if there are children. And then you're entitled to, you're entitled to perhaps make a claim on property, pensions, maintenance. So the protections are somewhat similar in that situation to a married situation.
Someone is asking if they have been separated and then diagnosed with MS. Do they even mention it in the divorce proceedings?
I mean, the divorce proceedings won't require that to be mentioned, no, but it may, I suppose it may be apparent in the divorce proceedings. I mean, I suppose, first of all, if it's a consent divorce, it may not necessarily need to be mentioned if the parties have reached their own conclusion. But if it's not a consent divorce, if it's a contested divorce, and if you're asking for the court to decide on what happens to, assets, all of that, well, then it may be relevant, I suppose, depending on the extent of somebody's illness, all the circumstances in that case would be relevant.
Okay, Pauline, I asked you when a couple might know when that they need therapy. On a personal level, what might be some signs that an individual might benefit from some professional help?
Well, definitely when they are caught in that negative cycle of communication, when it's really escalated and there's a lot of distress. The sooner they can catch that, I guess the shorter the therapy is likely to be. Because sometimes people do leave it because they don't realize they're in distress, because if they've grown up in highly escalated families, or where there's been a lot of insecure attachment, that level of distress may be or drama may be what they know. So they don't, so it does vary. Some people can tolerate quite a lot of distress, some people can't tolerate very much. So that's my experience, is there's quite a variety there. But I think the earlier it's caught, certainly it does help with the therapy.
Finding a therapist, particularly in rural Ireland, can be difficult. I suppose if a person is singularly seeing a therapist, or if a couple is and decide that they need to get other therapy, it's not really a good idea for a therapist to see both the couple and one of them as an individual. So it's how do you go about finding that other therapist? Because a lot of times there aren't many around.
That's true. And it's good if you are going to couples therapy and also you need some individual support, that the two therapies are compatible. So lots of EFT therapists, and there is an EFT Ireland website where you can, search for a therapist. So you'll be likely to get somebody who works in the same way, because EFT is a model that works, unlike maybe some top-down approaches that just work with cognition and behavior. It also is a bottom-up approach. It works very experientially, and especially with emotion. Emotion is the key to it, because it's considered to be the GPS of the attachment system. So it's very important to have the two therapies lined up, like you said, and also to ask your therapist for a referral. Who would they recommend? If, for example, if somebody runs into trouble in the couples therapy and needs some individual therapy, which frequently happens, a trauma comes up that hasn't been dealt with, they need some extra support. Well, then it really is a good idea for us to have people that we would feel, a therapist who's a safe pair of hands to send that person to.
And, I know that it can be very difficult for people who have never been in therapy. I'm a big
Sure.
fan. I feel like, we spend money tuning up our cars. We should probably and go to the gym for our bodies. We should do the same for our psyches, etc. But for a lot of people, it can be very uncomfortable. I think that people are of the opinion that you're assigned a therapist and that's it. You can sort of interview these people, right? I mean, that kind of help
Absolutely.
people understand the concept. Doing an informational interview with a couple of therapists is a good start.
It's a really good thing. Absolutely. There's such a thing as fit between therapist and client. And that's really important, again, to trust your gut on that. Is this the right person for me? Am I comfortable? Do I feel safe? Can I trust this person? And, that's really important for both. Yeah.
So, Gillian, we've got a lot of questions that are coming in relative to the one concept of when a couple has decided that it's over, or they're in that process, or they're in the courts, etc. Can MS be, inverted commas here, used against them? If it's a situation where it is not an amicable divorce, etc., and it is getting ugly, can the disease be used against us?
I suppose every case would be different. I mean, I had one recently where it wasn't MS, it was a client had neurological progressive condition. And in that case, the spouse tried to deny them access, said they weren't capable of minding the children. That was a case where they had balance issues. In that case, I suppose they did try and use their disease against them. In that particular case, I brought their neurologist to court. Their neurologist was extremely helpful. Their neurologist gave evidence that this person's condition did not put the children at risk. And ultimately, it's down the question that the court has to answer, and what influences every court's decision in terms of children is what's in the children's best interests. So it's in every child's best interests that they continue and maintain a relationship with both parents. So in this particular case, the other spouse was speculating, well, what will happen if this parent falls? What will happen if there's a fire? What will happen? And the court said that was all speculative. Their neurologist was giving very clear evidence that this person is capable of minding the children, and it was in the children's best interests. So yes, I suppose to answer your question, yes, it can be used, and you just have to deal with each case on the facts and present the best possible case. In terms then of, I suppose, the divvy up of assets and the dividing of assets and the proper provision, it wouldn't necessarily be used against the person, who has the disease. It may assist in sometimes in them getting perhaps a greater share of the assets, because they may require a greater share to properly provide for them. If somebody has a diagnosis, they may be precluded from getting a mortgage in the future. They may have difficulty getting their other spouse off the mortgage. So there may be arguments to get a greater share of the assets because of a diagnosis or because of a disability. And the law specifically says that the court can take into account if somebody has, and what I suppose the word that's used in the legislation is a disability. So it depends on how the disease has manifested itself in somebody as well.
Okay, very good. Pauline, we've got two sort of opposing questions that have come in. One is someone says, how do we make sure that MS isn't the center of our relationship? And then another question that has come in on the other side of that is the partner with MS doesn't want to talk about it at all. So you've got two opposings there. One is it seems to be all MS all the time, and the other is in sort of avoidance mode. So how do you come up with a happy medium? Do you set a schedule and for 20 minutes a day, we're going to talk about MS? Or I mean, what are some of the techniques?
Yeah, I guess there's no one size fits all, is there, with these big questions? But it's, again, how does with each of them, how does the couple make room for that? Or if one person is being impacted by their partner talking all the time about their MS, here's the opportunity maybe for them to trust the safety, trust the connection enough to be able to talk about how they're doing here, because it's a big transition for them too. Like, there's a wee piece here, isn't there, around when something when a major diagnosis comes up in a relationship. We've got to make room for both partners the impact of that on both partners. It might even seem a bit like a bit of a rupture in the relationship. A third party has come in here.
Mm-hmm.
How are we facing this together? How are we dealing with it differently? How can we make room for each other's differences? And if one person is talking about it all the time, well, what is driving that? Is it a fear of something, for example? Getting in underneath that preoccupation, I think, would be really important.
And we're talking about when bad relationships just can't be fixed. In these economic times, with the housing issues being what they are, the scenario by where a couple is in the process of dissolving their relationship, but are forced to continue to live together. Now we've got issues of marginalization and isolation, manipulation, possibly emotional extortion. I mean, when you've got two people who decided not to live together, have to live together. Give us a couple of notes there.
It's really difficult. It is really difficult. Again, it's about if once they've come to that decision, are they separating? Well, how can we do this in a respectful way? Because often a couple that continues to, co-create that amount of, or are still caught in that escalation, maybe they haven't fully made up their minds. Maybe they're still looking over their shoulder, or, so that's where I think individual therapy is needed if they can't step out of that negativity, because it is about, there often are children involved in those scenarios. How are we keeping a safe place for ourselves, for our children? Like, safety is primary here.
And it's going back to those
emotional safety,
emotional context that you were talking about. Some what you're doing is you're creating that anxious attachment for children that they're going to have to deal with later on. Exactly.
And we so easily forget that for a lot of children, a good separation is a lot healthier than endless tension and fighting in an unhappy relationship.
Okay. Gillian, let's say that the divorce, the agreement, the dissolution it's sorted, the maintenance is sorted, etc., and then MS being a progressive disease, it gets worse, circumstances change. Maybe the person with MS is supposed to be paying support, they can't earn as much anymore, or the person who has MS is receiving support and parenting, etc. That becomes difficult. MS does change. In general, it gets worse. So how does that affect a settlement? And it can be expensive to keep going back and getting settlements changed, can't it?
Absolutely. And I suppose that's a very good question, because it leads back to maintenance. So what we call maintenance. So maintenance can be paid for a spouse, or it can be paid for children. But maintenance is never set in stone. Maintenance, the law provides that maintenance can always be varied, and it can be varied if there's a change in circumstances. So let's say the person who is paying the maintenance is the person who's been diagnosed with MS, and let's say their income suddenly changes. They're no longer able to work, and they no longer have the resources or the ability to pay what was the court-ordered maintenance. If the maintenance was court-ordered, you then have no alternative but to apply to the court to vary the maintenance, and that involves going back into court. If you don't apply to the court to vary the maintenance and you simply stop paying the maintenance, or you unilaterally vary it, that results in arrears building up. You are legally still obliged to pay the maintenance as per the court order until it was varied. So it's very important, if you're the paying party and your circumstances change and you're no longer able to pay it, you immediately need to deal with a variation application. On the other hand, if you're the receiving party, and if you're receiving the maintenance and if you're the person who's diagnosed, and if your maintenance was, if the level of maintenance was based on you working at the time, working full time, suddenly you can't work, well, you then may need to go back to the court to vary for an uplift in the maintenance based on your change in circumstances. Because maintenance is needs versus resources. So it's what somebody's needs are versus somebody's resources. So If you have maintenance and you're no longer able to support yourself, well, then you may have to go back to the court, and the court will assess it based on your current circumstances once you prove a change in circumstances.
Oh. I'm sure that there's an awful lot of us watching this program right now that have just done the same thing. It's so much. And we've gone through a lot from meeting and disclosing to now post-divorce changing things. I want to thank both of you and give you a little bit of time, maybe 3 or 4 minutes apiece, to kind of wrap up any final thoughts. Pauline, when it comes to an incurable neurologic progressive disease and relationships, any final thoughts?
I think it's all about, back to where we started, just creating enough safety to make room for that, and being there for each other, and reaching, we know so much now, again, the survival of the nurtured. It's so, our connections are so important, that they're what keep us safe, and putting the quality of time and care, and maybe getting some support, getting some therapy to support that connection with something as like a major diagnosis like that, is so important, because we're trying to avoid all, the divorces and the separation. We're trying to maintain the connection, if at all possible. And sometimes it's because we don't know how. Sometimes it's just we never had that role modeled, or we don't know what a safe connection really looks like. We long for it, but we've never been able to experience it or co-create it. And it is totally doable.
Very good. Someone just asking a question. We talked a little bit about the setting a time aside, or talking about it being all the time. What if the person doesn't talk about it?
Then the other person needs to tell them what the impact of that silence is like for them.
Okay.
Because I'm sure there's fear on both sides. Or, if you're my partner and you're not talking about it, well, I still want to know what that is like for you. I still sense some fear from you around that, or I sense maybe you need a little bit of time. Am I right? I want to know that this is not driving us apart. So as your partner, I would want some reassurance around, well, is this a good silence, or is it a negative silence? How am I to respond? How do you want me to respond to this?
Okay, very good. Thank you. Sorry, go ahead. All right.
That's good.
Any final comments from you as to from the family law side of things?
Yeah, I suppose from our perspective, we get involved when somebody has decided that this marriage or relationship has broken down, and we have to deal with the consequences and regulate the consequences that flow from that. In my practice, I adopt a very much a solution-based approach. I very much favor mediation. I very much favor parties trying to reach their own agreement. And what must be remembered is, while the parties were together, they were funding perhaps one household out of the same income. Parties now have to figure out how they're going to fund two households out of the same income. The income or the resources that are there are not suddenly going to multiply. So people will have to reduce their income. People may have to reduce their standards. But the way to deal with this, the ideal way to deal with this, is a solution-based approach. If you've children, you're going to have to continue to deal with each other. You're going to have weddings, as I said, confirmations, graduations, all of that. So it's in everybody's best interests that you try and keep the acrimony out of the courts and try and reach your own resolution. It's also a lot cheaper. It's a lot less stressful. And if there are children, it's absolutely in their best interests.
All right. Well, to both of you, I want to say thank you so much. As we expected it would, our time has quickly come to an end. Your answers to so many of the questions that myself and our audience have posed to you, they were so well thought out. And I know that we've just touched the surface for a lot of people, but that's part of what this is about as well. The unspeakable bits are things that no one seems to have talked about. So just opening the door to these conversations. I want to thank you both, and to both of you, my guests, Pauline, Macey, and Gillian O'Mahony. Sorry, it's late, and the MS is coming along. We thank you for your time and for your talents. And don't forget, for our listeners and our viewers, to mark your diaries for the next Unspeakable Bits. We're going to shift the dates a little bit for May. For that episode, it's going to be on the eve of World MS Day, and connections are the focus of World MS Day. So we're going to be talking about the importance of staying in touch, about reconnecting with the world around us, and the difficulties that we might face as we try to get around MS. I know that a lot of people during the COVID lockdowns, they kind of experienced just a little slice of what many of us with MS have come to, unfortunately, be used to. So we're going to talk about those difficulties and all those other things about getting over, under, around, and through, making connections strong. And that will be on Monday, the 29th of May, and World MS Day is on Tuesday, the 30th. So, and until then, I'm Trevis L. Gleason, and I'm wishing you and your family the best of health. Cheers, and back to you, Fergal.
Yeah, again, I'd just like to thank Gillian and Pauline for a great talk. I really found that informative. And just let you know that it will go up over the next week or so onto MS Ireland's YouTube channel, this, and say also, if you want to register for the next one on the 29th, it's up in the news section now on our website, the MS Ireland website, and it'll be up. There'll be links tomorrow on all the social media channels. So again, and I'd like to thank you again for hosting, Trevis, and we look forward to seeing everybody in a month's time. Thanks very much. Take care.
Cheers.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.